We're going to study together Matthew chapter 23. And I told you last week we were starting a new sermon series, and it's called Cross Culture. And basically the question that we're asking is, what does it mean for our hearts and our minds and our lives to be shaped by the cross? And if you've been around for a few years here, you know that we have been off and on studying our way through the book of Matthew. And we ended in about Matthew 20 last year, and we're going to finish Matthew in this series. So it's going to be the end of the book of Matthew, and we're going to go until the Sunday after Easter. But we're also going to be studying through the book of Matthew as we do this. And we're going to be looking at what it teaches us about the culture of the cross. So we're going to read this story, and I want you to, as you follow along in Matthew 23, I need you to do something. Imagine for a moment that you are actually there in Jerusalem when Jesus is saying this, when this is being lived out for the first time. And I want to divide us into three sections, okay? Because there are kind of three different groups of people. There are Jesus' disciples, and that's not just the apostles. It's probably a number of other people that have decided we're going to follow Jesus. They are he's their rabbi. And I want this group over here. No. Yeah, you're the disciples, okay? You're the followers of Jesus. And I want you to kind of ask yourself, how would this sound to me? Now, this group, I want you to be the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, okay? These people have decided we're going to follow Jesus. Now, you got to understand, you're probably a little intimidated by them because, I mean, look at them. They're frightening anyway. But you are concerned, the teachers of the law, because this Jesus is saying things that kind of shake up the world around you. And it's endangering your status, your role, your privilege in the Jewish world. So I want you to listen to this and imagine what it would be to be skeptical. And Mike and Annette, you're in this group, okay? And, in fact, that's kind of symbolic because you're kind of above everyone else. So, that's okay. And this group over here, the rest of you, I want you to imagine that you are just kind of the random crowd. Maybe some of you have heard about this Jesus and you're intrigued to hear what he says, but you're not really sure. And you have lived your whole life looking to these people as the guides. They're the people that, for better or worse, you trust to kind of speak for God. But you know that this Jesus and his disciples, they're kind of shaking things up. Okay? Disciples, Sadducees, Pharisees, teachers of the law, the crowd. Then Jesus said to the crowd and his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you. Okay. You guys are liking this so far, right? Okay, that's good. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Not liking this, are you? Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves, glances at the teachers of the law, will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Woe to you, teachers of law. You notice that? He changed. It said at the beginning, he said he was talking to the crowd and his disciples, and he's been talking about them as if they're not there. And then he turns his eyes to them. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. Oh, this is fun. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. Terry's covering her ears back there. Rich is like, no. Woe to you, blind guides! You say if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold in the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools! Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by their oath. You blind man, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. Woe to you! You're like, okay, move on now. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides! You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs. which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the righteous, of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore, I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues. And by the way, when he says this, he's probably pointing to you guys. I'm sending you teachers and sages, and you're going to kill them. You're going to crucify them. You're going to flog them in your synagogues and pursue them from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the blood of Zach. That's kind of scary, isn't it? Son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come in this generation. And then he speaks to everybody. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Lord, speak from your word. In Jesus' name, amen. So I want to ask one more thing from you, just really quick. What were some of the feelings that you think might have been going through your group's minds and hearts as you listened to this? If you'd been there and you'd been part of the crowd, what are some of the, just throw out individual words or phrases, how would you have felt as you listened to this, understanding that it was kind of felt like you were observers of a battle? What were some of the words that might describe how you feel? Doubtful. Okay, good. What else? Disgusted. Okay. One more. Yeah, these are the people that you've been taught all your life to look to for answers and guidance. So, scribes, Pharisees, teachers of the law, as you listen to this man, this uneducated backwoods preacher, as he calls you 7 times, he says, woe to you. And literally, he's saying, curse you. He's really honestly kind of saying, you go to hell. 7 times, you hypocrites. What are you feeling? What are you thinking? Revenge. Crucify him. Yeah, that would have crossed your mind. What else? Yeah, anger, rage, slander. What? You're accusing us of this? Now, yeah, you don't want to do it. Yeah. It's kind of like if somebody says, yeah, you're such a jerk, you're going to punch me right now. And you're like, what do I do? If I punch him, So, followers of Jesus, what are you feeling in the midst of all this? Yeah, I mean, they don't just have religious authority, they have power. And you're like, okay, Jesus, do you really want to suggest that they're going to flog us and beat us? And don't give them those ideas. What else? Anything else? Yeah. Oh, yeah. A lot of responsibility. Yeah, because you have been taught by your culture to respect them. And maybe you're thinking, there's problems, but Jesus, are you getting a little carried away? So that's what's going on here. And let's dig into this. Because really what this is about the contrast between the internal and the external. And we live in a society that is all about the external, don't we? I mean, everything in our society right now, even our politics and our religion, is deeply shaped by social media. And social media is very much shaped by beauty, right? I mean, if you go on Snapchat, for instance, there are filters, and they are designed to make you look better than you are. Because that's the way our society works. It's about the external. But, I can't even point fingers at them, because the truth is that don't we think about that? Don't we sometimes worry more about what it will look like than what's really there? This week, I was at the Calvin Christian, Lansing Christian middle school volleyball game to watch Caleb and Zach play. And because of my neurological stuff I'm dealing with, bleachers are hard for me. And I don't know if anybody noticed that I was kind of struggling. And there was a moment after the game when I was going down the bleachers and I almost stumbled and fell. And you know what the first thought in my mind was? It wasn't that I could get hurt. My first thought is I would look stupid. Because we worry about appearances and what's on the outside. And Jesus is saying that's not the way it's supposed to be. Jesus says that we should be focused on what's inside. Let's dig a little deeper. Just so you know, this is Jesus' last public teaching. And you would think that his last message would be like about salvation and something graceful. I mean, honestly, if I was his like PR guy, I wouldn't say, last public teaching, Jesus, just really rip into the Pharisees. That's not what I would suggest. And up to this point, I mean, he's never had a good relationship with these people, but this is a whole nother level. And there's a couple key words that we have to understand. One is he keeps saying hypocrites. Now, that word literally means actors. And it wasn't necessarily a bad word. That wasn't an insult until Jesus made it one. And he said, you're pretending to be something you're not. And the other word that he says is woe. Literally, it's what nowadays people would say, oi! Meaning calamity, curse you. This is bad. And what does he tell us? And we're not going to walk through this verse by verse because there's a lot here. But a few things that Jesus wants us to know. Number one, Jesus wants us to know that the external does matter. Please understand that. He doesn't start out by saying what's on the outside isn't important. In fact, he says you should do everything the Pharisees tell you. He does say obey the law. And in fact, in verses 23 and 24, he says that we need to practice giving. We need to do things. What's on the outside does matter. The external matters. But he also says the external is too heavy. It's too much. We become slaves to the law, and Paul writes about that in several places in his epistles. He says, you can't fix the outside. Going back to the Snapchat filter thing, let's think about our faces and our bodies, and all of us spend some amount of time trying to make our hair and our face and our body look pretty good. Anybody feel like you've really won that battle? You know what? As I get older, I am just looking better and better. The external is too heavy. I remember we used to be, when I was in youth ministry, we had a bunch of students at a school where the basketball coach, his main means of punishment, like whenever anybody made a mistake or took a bad shot, he would pull them out. And so what we saw was this basketball team of pretty gifted athletes who were terrified to make a mistake. You would see it in their faces. They would be like, oh, I want to shoot, but oh, is this a bad shot? And if somebody scored on you, you were playing defense, you would see them glance over at the coach to see if they were going to be pulled out. Do you think that was a fun team to watch? No, there was no freedom at all. The external is too heavy. If we're trying to be perfect in everything we do, we will not. There's a story, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a great illustration. Supposedly, thousands of years ago, there was a flautist in the orchestra of the Emperor of China. The emperor had this orchestra, and it was like a good job. And this guy faked his way in. A modest salary, a comfortable living, and he really was not hardly he couldn't play the flute at all, hardly. And the emperor requested a solo performance from each musician one day. And this flute player was so scared. First, he pretended to be sick, but then they said, okay, you can play tomorrow, or the next day, or the next day. And eventually, this guy took poison and killed himself. And supposedly, that's where the phrase refusing to face the music came from. But do you see what that's about? Eventually, if we live our lives trying to look good, trying to be something that we're not, eventually we will face the music. So the external matters, but it's too heavy. The scriptures say repeatedly that we cannot. Well, let's go on. The next thing that we see as we look at what Jesus says is Jesus says, this is all about you. You want to impress people. Verse 5, everything they do is done for people to see. I want people to see me. I want them to be impressed by me. Notice the contrast between that and Jesus. A Pharisee says, look at my symbols, look at my impressive role in society. Jesus, on the other hand, says, I am on the throne of God, and I will leave it and lower myself. In fact, the symbols that Jesus ends up being identified with 2,000 years later are a cross and a crown of thorns and pierced hands. It's not the same as Jesus. The external is about me. The internal ultimately is about God. And we won't go there, but you might want to read Galatians 5:19 through 23. That says, the fruit of the sinful nature, the flesh, what is natural in our culture. And it lists all these things. And then it says, the fruit of the Spirit, if we have the Spirit working in us, is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control. The difference is huge. And it's interesting in that passage, Paul is not commanding those things. He's saying, if you live by the Spirit, that will become you. So what happens when we start with the external? Because that's what our culture says. Well, look at this. Jesus says, if you start with the external, you will get shut out of the kingdom. Verse 13 says, you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves will not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. If we start with the external, we are separating ourselves from the kingdom. I'm not saying we lose our salvation, but we're losing the freedom and the joy and the transformation and the victory that comes when we start with the internal. We get shut out ourselves. We shut other people out, Jesus says. And isn't that true? Don't we know that if when the world around us looks at Christians and sees us trying to look better than we are, number one, do they really believe us when we try to look like we've got it all together? No. And they don't want any of that. Jesus also says we end up focusing on less important things. Verse 24, I love this. He says, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Your whitewashed tombs. Now that would be even more offensive to them than it was to us. I mean, that's a real insult because dead bodies are unclean. Snakes and vipers, unclean. What happens when we start with the external? We won't listen to truth. Listen to verse 34. I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. You will kill and crucify and flog them and pursue them. When we're focused on the external, if we think we have to be Mary Poppins, practically perfect in every way, we will end up turning away from the truth. I want you to understand here, there's a contrast between the society around us and the culture of the cross. The culture around us wants to deny that people are sinners. Oh, that's not a real thing. But even the culture inside the church sometimes wants to say, oh, sin is out there. Anybody a sinner in here? There is a huge difference. In fact, the culture of the cross, hear this, I think this is important. Pray about this and think about this. Colossians chapter 1 says that Jesus, when he died on the cross, put sin on display. The brokenness of mankind was visible at that moment. It's paid for, it's forgiven, but whenever we try to hide what is true, we are working against the culture of the cross. So, how do we live in this new culture? How do we live with a real focus on the internal? Well, the good news in this passage is verse 37. After he's done all this, he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. He says, I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. Jesus says, I want to embrace you. I want to take you in my arms, knowing that you're hypocrites and broken people, and you are judgmental and hateful, and you focus on all the wrong stuff. And he says, I want to take you in my arms. Do you remember that moment, parents, when your child would become sick and they were like 2 or 3 years old and they would throw up all over themselves? And somehow in the midst of that, they are so beside themselves and crying, and you take them in your arms. Even though they smell awful, they are not cute at that moment. You love them. That's what Jesus is saying. Jerusalem, my people, you're messed up, but I love you. And this same Jesus, a few days later, dies on the cross. He dies on the cross. What does cross culture look like? It looks like a group of people who don't celebrate their sin. We're not saying that, oh, it's okay, but we're saying, I need Jesus. How about you? I'm broken. I blew it this week. How about you? We begin to confess our sin to each other. We begin to forgive each other. And it is a beautiful thing. I want to end this. We're going to sing a little song here, a short little chorus, and then I'm going to pray. But as we read this, as we sing this song, I want you to have in mind Ephesians 2, verse 10, that says, you, and he's talking to scribes and Pharisees and crowds and disciples. He says, you are God's workmanship, his work of art. Do you see what that's saying? The God who made the mountains, they're beautiful. You're better. The God who made the oceans and the night sky and who made the beautiful snow that's falling outside but is going to melt because spring is coming. I speak that to be true. God says, that's beautiful, but you're better. You're better. You're better. And so ultimately, it's not about something we do. It's about saying to God, Spirit, by the Spirit, wrap me in your arms. Let's sing that together.